Hello. Happy Wednesday, February 15th. February. Over halfway through the month. Yeah. Month and a half into 2023. Still winter though. I'm having a sleepy day. Probably at least in part because I had no coffee today. Cause and effect. You want this? You want this? Go get it. Ha. Nom, nom, nom. You like your rice cakes. Crunch, crunch, crunch. They don't taste like anything, but they do crunch. Snooze time. No, it's not snooze time yet. Even though it could be snooze time. If we were only brave enough. Thursday tomorrow. Farm Mouse has school. I'm gonna mute my phone. Good evening, happy Weds. Hi, Sharkies. And a happy Weds to you too. And a happy Weds to you, Binibik. How's it going, the Sharkies? What's new? How was your weekend? And then also your Monday and Tuesday and Wednesday. How were those 5 days? That's sort of how my Wednesday's been going. We had an open house on Saturday, and then a house showing on Monday, and then a house showing today. So we've had to be out of our house for various showings every other day, and had to make sure that our house is, you know, sparkly clean and presentable every other day. A bit foggy. Oh. That's... yeah, that's not great. Well, why don't we get to it a little quicker than usual then, in that case. So, I think we read 2 chapters on Friday. I think we read 22 and 23. Maybe we just read 23. Yeah, it must have been, because 22 was all about her presenting the idea of her being in charge, and I don't think we read that on Friday. I think that was the stream before. So 23 was all about... Oh, no, wait. No. We read 23 and 24. We read 23, 24. We didn't read 22. I don't know what's going on in my brain right now. I'm also apparently a little foggy. Just different way. So chapter 23 was all about Delben the Armorer, who did not get off to a great start. He had no respect for anybody, and especially women. By the end of things, he ended up doing what Sinedra wanted him to do and making her armor and a weapon. But he didn't make the armor enough, so that had to get fixed. For Sinedra's pride, or I don't know, self-esteem, I guess. And then 24, she, showed off a little bit and then had a chat with Polgara about exactly what she was up to. And then after that, she and Polgara had a chat with just about every female character we've met. Not every single one. They mentioned Poren, who was not present. And then there was probably the Dryads weren't present. And Vordai, of course, wasn't really involved in this. Other than that, we've only met 2 female characters that weren't there. But then Barak returned to Riva with a Draznian nobleman by the name of Karel, who was an earl or something? Or... Anyways, who had been off monitoring the Murgos. So Sinedra eavesdropped on that conversation through magics and discovered that this war they were getting themselves into was very likely to be a losing one in which they might all just die. And that they didn't really seem to have much of a chance of doing anything other than stalling for time. But yeah, probably a lot of death in the future. And she had some trouble stomaching that. And that brings us up to where we are now. Chapter 25. In my copy, it's on page 219. So, I guess I'll just get to it, huh? If everybody's ready. Minabik, are you ready? You look pretty ready. He's got a little paw up beside his face. Ready to spring into action. That's him. At the first hint that I might offer up a rice cracker. Okay. Chapter 25. Barak's new ship, was larger by half than most of the other Cherrick warboats in the fleet, but she moved before the spring breeze like a gull skimming low over the water. Barracks finally got his ship. You remember, I think it was back in Pawn of Prophecy where we first heard about that ship. Was it? Or it was either the end, like towards the end of Pawn of Prophecy. I think it was the end of Pawn of Prophecy. That's where they went to Cherrick, right? And he, at some point, went down to the docks to see the ribs of his ship under construction, and the shipmaster or whatever saying that he was going to, it was never going to move. He was going to need like the strong, like hundreds of strong men or something. I don't remember precisely how it was worded. Apparently it skims like a gull. Let's see. Like a gull skimming low over the water. Fleecy white clouds ran across the blue sky, and the surface of the Sea of the Winds sparkled in the sunlight as the great ship heeled over and cut cleanly through the waves. Low on the horizon before them rose the green shoreline of the Hook of Erendia. They were 2 days out from Riva, and the Cherrick fleet spread out behind them in a vast crowd of sails, carrying the grey-cloaked ravens to join the armies of King Fulrak of Sandaria. Sinedra nervously paced the deck near the prow, her blue cloak tossing in the wind and her armor gleaming. Despite the dreadful knowledge concealed in her heart, there was an excitement to all of this. The gathering of men, swords, and ships, the running before the wind, the sense of a unified purpose, all combined to make her blood race and to fill her with an exhilaration she had never felt before. The coast ahead loomed larger, a white sand beach backed by the dark green of the Erendish forest. As they neared the shoreline, an armored knight on a huge roan stallion emerged from the trees and rode down the beach to the edge of the water where foamy breakers crashed on the damp sand. The princess shaded her eyes with one hand and peered intently at the gleaming knight. Then, as he turned with a broad sweep of his arm which told them to continue up the coast, she saw the crest on his shield. Her heart suddenly soared. "Mandaralin!" she cried out in a vibrant trumpet note as she clung to the ropes in the very prow of Barak's ship, with the wind whipping at her hair. The great knight waved a salute and, spurring his charger, galloped through the seething foam at the edge of the beach, the silver and blue pennon at the tip of his lance snapping and streaming over his head. Their ship heeled over as Barak swung the tiller, and, separated by 100 yards or so of foaming surf, the ship and the rider on the beach kept abreast of each other. I've always liked that scene, that little Mandaralin riding on the coast as the ship, parallel to the ship. I've always found that very, easy to imagine and fanciful, I suppose. Very like a note of hopefulness. Sleepy puppy. Oh no, he heard me. Speaking of, the next line says, "It was a moment Sinedra would remember for all her life, a single image so perfect that it seemed forever frozen in her memory. The great ship flew before the wind, cutting the sparkling blue water, with her white sails booming. The mighty warhorse on the beach plunged through the gleaming foam at the edge of the sand, with spray flying out from beneath his great hooves. Locked together in that endless moment, ship and rider raced along in the warm spring sunshine toward a wooded promontory a mile ahead, with Sinedra exulting in the ship's prow and her flaming hair streaming like a banner. Need to drive it home just a little bit more. Beyond the promontory lay a sheltered cove, and drawn up on the beach stood the camp of the Sendarian army, row upon orderly row of dun-colored tents. Barak swung his tiller over, and his sails flapped as the ship coasted into the cove with the Cherek fleet close behind. "Ho, Mandaralin!" Barak bellowed as the anchor ropes sang, and great iron anchors plunged down through crystal water toward the sandy bottom. "My lord Barak," Mandaralin shouted his reply, "welcome to Erendia. Lord Brendig hath devised a means to speed thy disembarking." He pointed to where 100 or so Sendarian soldiers were busily poling a series of large rafts into position, lashing them together to form a long floating wharf extending out into the waters of the cove. Oh, yeah. Yeah. Like in, like a scene out of Lady Hawk or something. The, like, sun, for effect in this scene, the sun would be, like, setting, and you'd have those, like, hazy lines. Maybe, like, an eagle screams overhead or something. A hawk. Now I'm thinking of Lady Hawk specifically. Too much. Barak laughed. "Trust a Sendar to come up with something practical." "Can we go ashore now?" King Rodar asked plaintively as he emerged from the cabin. The king was not a good sailor, and his broad, round face had a pale greenish cast to it. He looked oddly comical in his mail shirt and helmet, and the ravages of seasickness on his face added little to his dignity. Despite his unwarlike exterior, however, the other kings had already begun to defer to his wisdom. Beneath his vast rotundity, Rodar concealed a genius for tactics and a grasp of overall strategy that made the others turn to him almost automatically and accept his unspoken leadership. The painted van image. I don't know, the painted van usually either needs a girl in a chainmail bikini or a wizard or both. Maybe a dragon. A small fishing boat that had been pressed into service as a ferry drew alongside Barak's ship, almost before the anchors had settled, and the kings and their generals and advisers were transferred to the beach in less than half an hour. "I think I'm hungry," Rodar announced the moment he stepped onto solid ground. Anheg laughed. "I think you were born hungry." The king wore a mail shirt and had a broad sword belt about his waist. His coarse features seemed less out of place somehow, now that he was armed. "I haven't been able to eat for 2 days, Anheg," Rodar groaned. "My poor stomach's beginning to think I've abandoned it." "Food hath been prepared, your majesty," Mandaralin assured him. "Our Asturian brothers have provided goodly numbers of the king's deer, doubtless obtained lawfully, though I chose not to investigate that too closely." Someone standing in the group behind Mandaralin laughed, and Sinedra looked at the handsome young man with reddish gold hair and the long bow slung over the shoulder of his green doublet. Who could that be? Sinedra had not had much opportunity to become acquainted with Leldoran of Wildantor while they had been at Riva. She knew him to be Garion's closest friend, however, and she realized the importance of gaining his confidence. It should not be too hard, she decided as she looked at his open, almost innocent face. The gaze he returned was very direct, and one glance into those eyes told the princess that there was a vast sincerity and very little intelligence behind them. Harsh. Almost innocent. He very innocently beat that priest. Knocked out his teeth.
We've heard from Belgarath,
Barak advised Mandaralin and the young Asturian.
Where are they?
Leldorin demanded eagerly.
They were in Boktor,
King Rodar replied, his face still a trifle green from his bout of seasickness.
For reasons of her own, my wife let them pass through. I imagine they're somewhere in Garog Nadrek by now.
Leldorin's eyes flashed.
Maybe if I hurry, I can catch up with them,
he said eagerly, already starting to look around for his horse.
It's 1,500 leagues, Leldorin,
Barak pointed out politely.
Oh,
Leldorin seemed a bit crestfallen.
I suppose you're right. It would be a little difficult to catch them now, wouldn't it?
Barak nodded gravely. And then the blonde Mimbrate girl, Ariana, stepped forward, her heart in her eyes.
My lord,
she said to Leldorin, and Senedra remembered with a start that the two were married. Technically, at least.
Thine absence hath given me great pain.
Leldorin's eyes were immediately stricken.
My Ariana,
he almost choked.
I swear that I'll never leave you again.
He took both her hands in his and gazed adoringly into her eyes. The gaze she returned was just as full of love and just as empty of thought. Senedra shuddered inwardly. I love how the two of them, just looking at each other is, physically painful for anyone else around them. All right. Senedra shuddered inwardly at the potential for disaster implicit in the look the two exchanged. I just don't know how frequently it's going to happen. It's a good square, but I feel like it'll be one of the ones that would sit empty. Or could, anyways.
Does anyone care that I'm starving to death right here on the spot?
Rodar asked. The banquet was laid on a long table set up beneath a gaily striped pavilion on the beach, not far from the edge of the forest. The table quite literally groaned under its weight of roasted game, and there was enough to eat to satisfy even the enormous appetite of King Rodar. When they had finished eating, they lingered at the table in conversation.
Thy son, Lord Hetar, hath advised us that the Algar clans are gathering at the stronghold, your majesty,
Mandaralin reported to King Johag. Johag nodded.
And we've had word from the Ulgo, Relg,
Colonel Brendig added. I don't remember what he sounds like, so now he's going to sound more military.
He's gathered a small army of warriors from the caves. They'll wait for us on the Algarian side of the mountains. He said you'd know the place.
Barak grunted.
The Ulgos can be troublesome, he said. They're afraid of open places, and daylight hurts their eyes. But they can see in the dark like cats. That could be very useful at some point.
Did Relg send any personal messages? Taiba asked Brendig, with a little catch in her voice. Gravely, the Sendar took a folded parchment from the inside of his tunic and handed it to her. She took it with a rather helpless expression and opened it, turning it this way and that. "What's the matter, Taiba?" Adara asked quietly. "He knows I can't read," Taiba protested, holding the note tightly pressed against her. "I'll read it to you," Adara offered. "But maybe it's, well, personal," Taiba objected. "I promise I won't listen," Adara told her, without the trace of a smile. Chekhov's Ulgo, not, Are you thinking of, starts with an S? Schrodinger's Ulgo? I don't know that Chekhov had much to do with cats, did he? Unless you're thinking that them seeing like cats in the dark is going to have to come up later. I mean, you know, it almost certainly will. I like that bit, though. Adara offers to read it and promises not to listen. Sinedra covered her own smile with her hand. Adara's penetrating and absolutely straight-faced wit was one of the qualities that most endeared her to the princess. Even as she smiled, however, Sinedra could feel eyes on her, and she knew that she was being examined with great curiosity by the Eddings, both Asturian and Mimbrate, who had joined them. Leldorin, in particular, seemed unable to take his eyes from her. The handsome young man sat close beside the blonde Mimbrate girl Ariana, and stared openly at Sinedra, even while, unconsciously perhaps, he held Ariana's hand. Careful, Leldorin. We don't want Sinedra to get stabbed. Sinedra endured his scrutiny with a certain nervousness. To her surprise, she found that she wanted this rather foolish young man's approval. "Tell me," she said directly to him, "what are the sentiments here in Asturia? Concerning our campaign, I mean." Leldorin's eyes clouded. "Unenthusiastic for the most part, Your Majesty," he replied. "I'm afraid there's suspicion that this might all be some Mimbrate plot." "That's absurd," Sinedra declared. Leldorin shrugged. "It's the way my countrymen think, and those who don't think it's a plot are looking at the idea that all the Mimbrate knights might join a crusade against the East. That raises certain hopes in some quarters." Mandaralin sighed. "The same sentiments exist in some parts of Mimbre," he said. "We are a woefully divided kingdom, and old hatreds and suspicions die hard." Sinedra felt a sudden wave of consternation. She had not counted on this. King Rodar had made it plain that he absolutely had to have the Eddings, and now the idiotic hatred and suspicion between Mimbre and Asturia seemed about to bring the entire plan crashing down around her ears. Helplessly, she turned to Polgara. The sorceress, however, seemed undisturbed by the news that the Eddings were reluctant to join the campaign. Tell me, Leldoran, she said calmly, could you gather some of your less suspicious friends in one place, some secure place where they won't be afraid we might want to ambush them? What have you got in mind, Polgara? King Rodar asked, his eyes puzzled. Someone's going to have to talk to them, Polgara replied. Someone rather special, I think. She turned back to Leldoran. I don't think we'll want a large crowd. Not at first, anyway. 40 or 50 ought to be enough, and no one too violently opposed to our cause. I'll gather them at once, Lady Polgara, Leldoran declared, impulsively leaping to his feet. It's rather late, Leldoran, she pointed out, glancing at the sun hovering low over the horizon. That could be a bingo square. Leldoran receives a request and decides it has to happen immediately. The sooner I start, the sooner I can gather them, Leldoran said fervently. If friendship and the ties of blood have any sway at all, I will not fail. He bowed deeply to Sinedra. Your Majesty, he said by way of farewell, and ran to where his horse was tethered. Ariana sighed as she looked after the departing young enthusiast. How long was it since his vow? It was 1 page. Well, 2. Well, 1 page front and back. 1 page front and back since he vowed never to leave her again. He swore. He swore that he'll never leave her again at the top of 221, and he ran off at the bottom of 222. And she's just like, ah. Ariana sighed as she looked after the departing young enthusiast. Is he always like that? Sinedra asked her curiously. The Mimbrate girl nodded. Always, she admitted. Thought and deed are simultaneous with him. He hath no understanding of the meaning of the word reflection, I fear. It doth add to his charm, but it is sometimes disconcerting, I must admit. I can imagine, Sinedra agreed. Later, when the princess and Polgara were alone in their tent, Sinedra turned a puzzled look upon Garion's aunt. What are we going to do? She asked. Not we, Sinedra. You. You're going to have to talk to them. I'm not very good at speaking in public, Lady Polgara, Sinedra confessed, her mouth going dry. Crowds frighten me, and I get all tongue-tied. I feel like I'm blending her voice with Leldoran's a little bit. You'll get over it, dear, Polgara assured her. She looked at the princess with a slightly amused expression. You're the one who wanted to lead an army, remember? Did you really think that all you were going to have to do was put on your armor, jump into the saddle, and shout, "Follow me," and then the whole world would fall in behind you? Well, you spent all that time studying history and missed the one thing all great leaders have had in common. You must have been very inattentive, Sinedra. Sinedra stared at her with slowly dawning horror. It doesn't take that much to raise an army, dear. You don't have to be brilliant. You don't have to be a warrior. Your cause doesn't even have to be great and noble. All you have to do is be eloquent. I can't do that, Lady Polgara. Seems like a slightly odd stumbling point for Sinedra. Isn't that, like, the majority of what she does?
I mean, I guess we haven't seen her in front of a really big crowd, but we have heard that she, you know, performed sports in the nude in front of crowds, stadiums. So, I don't know. Seems slightly contrived, but I guess performing and speaking are not the same thing. But also, Imperial Princess. Maybe she was expected to always be just sitting prettily on the sidelines or something and not actually speaking to people. I can't do that, Lady Polgara. You should have thought of that before, Sinedra. It's too late to go back now. Rodar will command the army and see to it that all the details are taken care of, but you're the one who will have to make them want to follow you. I wouldn't have the faintest idea what to say to them, Sinedra protested. It'll come to you, dear. You do believe in what we're doing, don't you? Of course, but you decided to do this, Sinedra. You decided it all by yourself. And as long as you've come this far, you might as well go all the way. Please, Lady Polgara, Sinedra begged. Speaking in public makes me sick to my stomach. I'll throw up. That happens now and then, Polgara observed calmly. Just try not to do it in front of everybody. 3 days later, the princess, Polgara, and the Alorn kings journeyed to the ruined city of Vo Aster, deep in the silences of the Erendish forest. The ruined city of Vo Aster. Let's see if we can spot that on the map. Yeah, there it is. It's still in the forest. So it's that black square by the river right there. Vo Aster. The ruined city of Vo Aster, deep in the silences of the Erendish forest. Sinedra rode through the sunny woods in a state hovering on the verge of panic. In spite of all her arguments, Polgara had remained adamant. Tears had not budged her, even hysterics had failed. The princess was morbidly convinced that, even if she were to die, Polgara would prop her up in front of the waiting throng and make her go through the agony of addressing them. Feeling absolutely helpless, she rode to meet her fate. Weekend at Sinedra's. Like Vo Wassoon, I don't know if we settled on Vo Wassoon or Vo Wakun. It was Wassoon, because it's the Wassite errands. Like Vo Wassoon, Vo Aster had been laid waste during the dark centuries of the Erendish Civil War. Its tumbled stones were green with moss, and they lay in the shade of vast trees that seemed to mourn the honor, pride, and sorrow of Asturia. Leldorin was waiting, and with him were perhaps 50 richly dressed young noblemen, their eyes filled with curiosity, faintly tinged with suspicion. It's as many as I could bring together in a short time, Lady Polgara, Leldorin apologized after they had dismounted. There are others in the region, but they're convinced that our campaign is some kind of Mimbrate treachery. These will do nicely, Leldorin, Polgara replied. They'll spread the word about what happens here. She looked around at the mossy, sun-dappled ruins. I think that spot over there will be fine. She pointed at a broken bit of one of the walls. Come with me, Sinedra. The princess, dressed in her armor, hung her helmet and shield on the saddle of the white horse King Chohag had brought for her from Algaria, and led the patient animal as she tremblingly followed the sorceress. We want them to be able to see you as well as hear you, Polgara instructed,
so climb up on that piece of wall and speak from there. The spot where you'll be standing is in the shade now, but the sun's moving around so that it'll be fully on you as you finish your speech. I think that'll be a nice touch." Sinedra quailed as she saw how far the sun had to go. "I think I'm going to be sick," she said in a quivering little voice. "Maybe later, Sinedra. You don't have time just now." Polgara turned to Leldorin. "I think you can introduce Her Majesty now," she told him. "Right to it." Leldorin stepped up onto the wall and held up his hand for silence. "Countrymen," he announced in a loud voice, "last Eristide an event took place which shook our world to its foundations. For 1,000 years and more we have awaited that moment. My countrymen, the Revan King has returned!" The throng stirred at his announcement, and an excited buzz rippled through it. Leldorin, always extravagant, warmed to his subject. He told them of the flaming sword that had announced Garion's true identity, and of the oaths of fealty sworn to Belgarion of Riva by the Alorn kings. Sinedra, almost fainting with nervousness, scarcely heard him. She tried to run over her speech in her mind, but it all kept getting jumbled. Then, in near panic, she heard him say, "Countrymen, I present to you Her Imperial Highness, Princess Sinedra, the Revan Queen!" All eyes turned expectantly to her. Princess Sinedra, the Revan Queen. It's odd because I guess, she is both of those things, princess and queen, kind of. But it's a little odd that, the one doesn't replace the other. Oh, puppy. Trembling in every limb, she mounted the broken wall and looked at the faces before her. All her preparations, all the rehearsed phrases, evaporated from her mind, and she stood, white-faced and shaking, without the faintest idea of how to begin. The silence was dreadful. As chance had it, one of the young Asturians in the very front had tasted perhaps more wine that morning than was good for him. "I think Her Majesty has forgotten her speech," he snickered loudly to one of his companions. Sinedra's reaction was instantaneous. "And I think the gentleman has forgotten his manners," she flared, not even stopping to think. Incivility infuriated her. "I don't think I'm going to listen to this," the tipsy young man declared in a tone filled with exaggerated boredom. "It's just a waste of time. I'm not a Revan, and neither are any of the rest of you. What could a foreign queen possibly say that would be of any interest to Asturian patriots?" And he started to turn away. "Is the patriotic Asturian gentleman so wine-soaked that he's forgotten that there's more to the world than this forest?" Sinedra retorted hotly. "Or perhaps—" "Oh, that's how it's done. You want a speech from Sinedra? Start an argument." "Or perhaps he's so unschooled that he doesn't know what's happening out there." She leveled a threatening finger at him. "Hear me, patriot," she said in a ringing voice. "You may think that I'm just here to make some pretty little speech, but what I've come to say to you is the most important thing you'll ever hear. You can listen, or you can turn your back and walk away. And a year from now, when there is no Asturia, and when your homes are smoking in ruins and the Grolims are herding your families to the altar of Torak with its fire and its bloody knives, you can look back on this day and curse yourself for not listening." And then, As if her anger with this one rude young man had suddenly burst a dam within her, Sinedra began to speak. She spoke to them directly, not with the studied phrases she had rehearsed, but with words that came from her heart. The longer she spoke, the more impassioned she became. She pleaded, she cajoled, and finally she commanded. She would never remember exactly what she said, but she would never forget how she felt as she said it. All the passion and fire that had filled the stormy outbursts and tantrums of her girlhood came into full play. She spoke fervently, with no thought of herself, but rather with an all-consuming belief in what she said. In the end, she won them over. As the sun fell full upon her, her armor gleamed and her hair seemed to leap into flame. "Belgarion, king of Riva and overlord of the West, calls you to war," she declared to them. "I am Sinedra, his queen, and I stand before you as a living banner. Who among you will answer Belgarion's call and follow me?" It was the young man who had laughed at her, whose sword leaped first into his hand. Raising it in salute, he shouted, "I will follow!" As if his declaration were a signal, 100 swords flashed in the sunlight as they were raised in salute and pledge, and 100 voices echoed his shout, "I will follow!" With a broad sweep of her arm, Sinedra drew her own sword and lifted it. "Follow, then!" she sang to them. "We ride to meet the fell hordes of Angarak. Let the world tremble at our coming!" With 3 quick steps, she reached her horse and literally threw herself into the saddle. She wheeled her prancing mount and galloped from the ruins, her sword aloft and her flaming hair streaming. The Asturians, as one man, rushed to their horses to follow. As she plunged into the forest, the princess glanced back once at the brave, foolish young men galloping behind her, their faces exalted. She had won, but how many of these unthinking Asturians would she lead back when the war was done? How many would die in the wastes of the east? Her eyes suddenly filled with tears, but, dashing those tears away with one hand, the Revan queen galloped on, leading the Asturians back to join her army. Oh boy. Did that not go well, winging a speech? Drunk guy is dependably convinced. Well, it's only 7:48. How's your head feeling, Sharkies? Chapter 26 is a little bit on the longer side, so I don't think we'll be finishing it. We could start it if people want to, or if people are having a sleepy night, I would be all right if we stopped here. I won't be upset. Ah, you're so cute, Min. You're so cute, you need a snack. He's like, okay. Your terms are agreeable. Another 20 minutes? Yeah. Let's go to maybe 10 past 8. Sure. I will get into chapter 26 then.
This one's going in your bed.
Oh, I missed. Oh well. Chapter 26. The Alorn kings praised Sinedra extravagantly, and hard-bitten warriors looked at her with open admiration. Ben? I saw that. And hard-bitten warriors looked at her with open admiration. She lapped up their adulation and purred like a happy kitten. The only thing that kept her triumph from being complete was Polgara's strange silence. Sinedra was a little hurt by that. The speech had not been perfect, perhaps, but it had won Lildoran's friends completely, and surely success made up for any minor flaws. Then, when Polgara sent for her that evening, Sinedra thought she understood. The sorceress wished to congratulate her in private. Oh, that's definitely what's going to happen here. Humming happily to herself, the princess went along the beach to Polgara's tent with the sound of waves on the white sand in her ears. Ah, oceanside camping. Oh no. Polgara sat at her dressing table, alone except for the sleepy child, Erend. The candlelight played softly over her deep blue robe and the perfection of her features as she brushed her long dark hair. Little stuttering there. "Come in, Sinedra," she said. "Sit down. We have a great deal to discuss." "Were you surprised, Lady Polgara?" The princess could no longer contain herself. "You were, weren't you? I even surprised myself." Polgara looked at her gravely. "You mustn't allow yourself to become so excited, Sinedra. You have to learn to conserve your strength and not squander it by dashing about in hysterical self-congratulation." Bit harsh. Sinedra stared at her. "Don't you think I did well today?" she asked, hurt to the quick. "It was a very nice speech, Sinedra," Polgara told her in a way that took all the fun out of it. Sinedra is learning what Garion's had to deal with his whole life. A strange thought occurred to the princess then. "You knew, didn't you?" she blurted. "You knew all along." A faint flicker of amusement touched Polgara's lips. "You always seem to forget that I have certain advantages, dear," she replied. "Yeah." "And one of those is that I have a general idea of how things are going to turn out." "How could you possibly?" "Certain events don't just happen, Sinedra. Some things have been implicit in this world since the moment it was made. What happened today was one of those things." She reached over and picked up an age-darkened scroll from the table. "Would you like to hear what the prophecy says about you?" Sinedra felt a sudden chill. Polgara ran her eyes down the crackling parchment. "Here it is," she said, lifting the scroll into the candlelight. "And the voice of the Bride of Light shall be heard in the kingdoms of the world," she read. "And her words shall be as a fire in dry grass, that the multitudes shall rise up to go forth under the blaze of her banner." "That doesn't mean anything at all, Lady Polgara," Sinedra objected. "It's absolute gibberish." "Does it become any clearer when you find out that Garion is the child of light?" It doesn't really seem like that much gibberish to me. I don't know. "What is that?" Sinedra demanded, staring at the parchment. "Where did you get it?" "It's the Mrin Codex, dear. My father copied it for me from the original. It's a bit obscure because the Mrin prophet was so hopelessly insane that he couldn't speak coherently. King Draz Bullneck finally had to keep him chained to a post like a dog. King Draz? Lady Polgara, that was over 3,000 years ago. About that long, yes, Polgara agreed. Sinedra began to tremble. That's impossible, she blurted. Polgara smiled. Sometimes, Sinedra, you sound exactly like Garion. I wonder why young people are so fond of that word. But, Lady Polgara, if it hadn't been for that young man who was so insulting, I might not have said anything at all. The princess bit her lip. She had not meant to confess that. That's probably why he was so insulting then. It's quite possible that insulting you at that particular moment was the only reason he was born in the first place. Sucks for that guy. The prophecy leaves nothing to chance. Do you think you might need him to help you get started next time? I can arrange to have him get drunk again if you do. Next time? Of course. Did you think that one speech to a very small audience was going to be the end of it? Imagine being that in the university. Not to bring up the Rick and Morty butter robot, but... Did you think that one speech to a very small audience was going to be the end of it? Really, Sinedra, you have to learn to pay more attention to what's going on. You're going to have to speak in public at least once a day for the next several months. The princess stared at her in horror. I can't, she wailed. Yes, you can, Sinedra. Your voice will be heard in the land, and your words shall be as a fire in dry grass, and the multitudes of the West shall rise up to follow your banner. Down through all the centuries, I've never known the Mrin Codex to be wrong. Not once. The important thing, at the moment, is for you to get plenty of rest and to eat regularly. I'll prepare your meals myself. She looked rather critically at the tiny girl. It would help if you were a bit more robust, but I guess we'll have to make do with what we have. Go get your things, Sinedra. From now on, you will be staying with me. I think I'm going to want to keep an eye on you. In the weeks that followed, they moved down through the moist, green, orangish forest. Sorry about that. And the word of their coming spread throughout Asturia. Sinedra was dimly aware that Polgara was carefully controlling the size and composition of the audiences to be addressed. Poor Leldorin was seldom out of his saddle, as he and a carefully selected group of his friends ranged ahead of the advancing army to prepare each gathering. Sinedra, once she had finally accepted her duty, had assumed that speaking in public would grow easier with practice. Unfortunately, she was wrong. Panic still gripped her before each speech, and quite frequently she was physically sick. Although Polgara assured her that her speeches were getting better, Sinedra complained that they were not getting easier. The drain on her physical and emotional reserves became more and more evident. Like most girls her age, Sinedra could, and often did, talk endlessly, but her orations were not random talk. They required an enormous control and a tremendous expenditure of emotional energy, and no one could help her. Random shot at most girls her age. Sinedra running up the stairs to the library? I don't know what that building actually was. As the crowds grew larger, however, Polgara did provide aid in a purely technical matter. Just speak in a normal tone of voice, Sinedra, she instructed. Don't exhaust yourself by trying to shout. I'll see to it that everybody can hear you. Aside from that, however, the princess was on her own, and the strain became more and more visible. She rode listlessly at the head of her growing army, seeming sometimes almost to be in a trance. Her friends watched her and worried. She's learning how Belgarath picked up his trick of sleeping in the saddle. You just gotta lead an army. I'm not sure how much longer she can keep up this pace, King Fulrak confided to King Rodar, as they rode directly behind the drooping little queen toward the ruins of Voasun, where she was to address yet another gathering. I think we tend sometimes to forget how small and delicate she is. Maybe we'd better consult with Polgara, King Rodar agreed. I think the child needs a week's rest. Sinedra, however, knew that she could not stop. There was a momentum to this, a kind of accelerating rhythm that could not be broken. At first, word of her coming had spread slowly, but now it ran ahead of them, and she knew they must run faster and faster to keep up with it. There was a crucial point at which the curiosity about her must be satisfied, or the whole thing would collapse and she'd have to begin all over again. The crowd at Voasun was the largest she had yet addressed. Half convinced already, they needed only a single spark to ignite them. Once again, sick with unreasoning panic, the Raven Queen gathered her strength and rose to address them and to set them aflame with her call to war. When it was over, and the young nobles had been gathered into the growing ranks of the army, Sinedra sought a few moments of solitude on the outskirts of the camp to compose herself. This had become a kind of necessary ritual for her. Sometimes she was sick after a speech, and sometimes she wept. Sometimes she merely wandered listlessly, not even seeing the trees about her. At Polgar's instruction, Dernick always accompanied her, and Sinedra found the company of this solid, practical man strangely comforting. Garion's not around, so Dernick's taking care of Sinedra. Instead of Dernick taking care of Garion is what I meant by that, not instead of Garion taking care of Sinedra. They had walked some distance from the ruins. The afternoon was bright and sunny, and birds sang among the trees. Yeah. Different ruins in a forest every night. They had walked some distance from the ruins. The afternoon was bright and sunny, and birds sang among the trees. Pensively, Sinedra walked, letting the peace of the forest quiet the agitated turmoil within her. Oh boy. Everybody ready? It's all very well for noblemen, Detton, she heard someone say somewhere on the other side of a thicket. But what does it have to do with us? You're probably right, Lammer, a second voice agreed with a regretful sigh. It was very stirring, though, wasn't it? Does everyone remember Detton and Lammer? The only thing that ought to stir a serf is the sight of something to eat, the first man declared bitterly. It's the return of the peasants. The little girl can talk all she wants about duty, but my only duty is to my stomach." He stopped abruptly. "Are the leaves of that plant over there fit to eat?" he asked. "I think they're poisonous, Lammer," Detton replied. "But you're not sure? I'd hate to pass up something I could eat if there was any chance that it wouldn't kill me." Sinedra listened to the two serfs with growing horror. Could anybody be reduced to that level? Impulsively, she stepped around the thicket to confront them. Dernick, as always, stayed close by her side. Oh, hang on. Talking to the serfs and not just eavesdropping on them? The two serfs were dressed in mud-spattered rags. They were both men of middle years, and there was no evidence on their faces that either of them had ever known a happy day. The leaner of the two was closely examining a thick-leafed weed, but the other saw Sinedra approaching and started with obvious fright. "Lammer!" he gasped. "It's her! The one who spoke today!" Lammer straightened, his gaunt face going pale beneath the dirt that smudged it. "Your ladyship," he said, grotesquely trying to bow. "We were just on our way back to our villages. We didn't know this part of the forest was yours. We didn't take anything." He held out his empty hands as if to prove his words. "How long has it been since you've had anything to eat?" she demanded of him. Lammer, yeah. "I ate some grass this morning, your ladyship," Lammer replied. "And I had a couple of turnips yesterday. They were a little wormy, but not too bad." Turnips? Sinedra's eyes suddenly filled with tears. "Who's done this to you?" she asked him. Lammer looked a little confused at her question. Finally, he shrugged slightly. "World, I guess, your ladyship. Certain part of what we raise goes to our lord, and a certain part of that, and a certain part to his lord. Then there's the part that has to go to the king, and the part that has to go to the royal governor, and we're still paying for some wars my lord had a few years ago. After all of that's been paid, there isn't very much left for us." A horrible thought struck her. "I'm gathering an army for the campaign in the east," she told them. "Yes, your ladyship," the other serf, Detton, replied. "We heard your speech today." "What will that do to you?" Detton shrugged. "It will mean more taxes, your ladyship, and some of our sons will be taken for soldiers if our lords decide to join you. Serfs don't really make very good soldiers, but they can always carry baggage. And when the time comes to storm a castle, nobility seem to want to have a lot of serfs around to help with the dying." "Then you never feel any patriotism when you go to war?" "What could patriotism have to do with serfs, my lady?" Lammer asked her. "Until a month or so ago, I didn't even know the name of my country. None of it belongs to me. Why should I have any feelings about it?" Sinedra could not answer that question. Their lives were so bleak, so hopelessly empty, and her call to war meant only greater hardship and more suffering for them. "What about your families?" she asked. "If Torak wins, the Grolims will come and slaughter your families on his altars." "I have no family, my lady," Lammer replied in a dead voice. "My son died several years ago. My lord was fighting a war somewhere, and when they attacked a castle, the people inside poured boiling pitch down on the serfs who were trying to raise a ladder. My wife starved herself to death after she heard about it. The Grolims can't hurt either one of them now, and if they want to kill me, they're welcome to." "Isn't there anything at all you'd be willing to fight for?" "Food, I suppose," Lammer said after a moment's thought. "I'm very tired of being hungry." Sinedra turned to the other serf. What about you? She asked him.
I'd walk into a fire for somebody who fed me,
Denton replied fervently. Come with me, Sinedra commanded them. And she turned and led the way back to the camp and the large, bulky supply wagons that had transported the vast quantities of food from the storehouses of Sandaria. I want these 2 men fed, she told a startled cook, as much as they can eat. Dernick, however, his honest eyes brimming with compassion, had already reached into one of the wagons and taken out a large loaf of bread. He tore it in two and gave half to Lammer and half to Detton. Lammer stared at the chunk of bread in his hands, trembling violently.
I'll follow you, my lady,
he declared in a quavering voice.
I've eaten my shoes and lived on boiled grass and tree roots.
His fists closed about the chunk of bread as if he were afraid someone might try to take it away from him.
I'll follow you to the end of the world and back for this.
And he began to eat, tearing at the bread with his teeth. Sinedra stared at him, and then she suddenly fled. By the time she reached her tent, she was weeping hysterically. Adara and Taiba tried without success to comfort her, and finally they sent for Polgara. When the sorceress arrived, she took one brief look and asked Taiba and Adara to leave her alone with the sobbing girl. All right, Sinedra, she said calmly, sitting on the bed and gathering the princess in her arms. What's this all about? I can't do it any more, Lady Polgara, Sinedra cried. I just can't. It was your idea in the first place, Polgara reminded her. I was wrong, Sinedra sobbed. Wrong. I should have stayed in Riva. No, Polgara disagreed. You've done something that none of the rest of us could have. You've guaranteed us the errands. I'm not even sure Garion could have done that. But they're all going to die, Sinedra wailed. Where did you get that idea? The Angarax are going to outnumber us at least 2 to 1. They'll butcher my army. Who told you that? I listened, Sinedra replied, fumbling with the amulet at her throat. I heard what Rodar, Anheg, and the others said when they heard about the southern Murgos. I see, Polgara said gravely. We're going to throw away our lives. Nothing can save us. And just now I even found a way to bring the serfs into it. Their lives are so miserable that they'll follow me just for the chance to eat regularly. And I'll do it, Lady Polgara. If I think I might need them, I'll deliberately take them from their homes and lead them to their deaths. I can't help myself. Polgara took a glass from a nearby table and emptied a small glass vial into it. The war isn't over yet, Sinedra. It hasn't even begun. She swirled the dark amber liquid around in the bottom of the glass. I've seen hopeless wars won before. If you give in to despair before you begin, you will have no chance at all. Rodar's a very clever tactician, you know, and the men in your army are very brave. We won't commit to any battle unless we absolutely have to. And if Garion can reach Torak in time, and if he wins, the Angarax will fall apart, and we won't have to fight them at all. Here, she held out the glass. Drink this. Numbly, Sinedra took the glass and drank. The amber liquid was bitter, and it left a strange, fiery aftertaste in her mouth. It all depends on Garion, then, she said. It always has depended on him, dear, Polgara told her. Sinedra sighed. I wish, she began, then faltered to a stop. Wish what, dear? "Oh, Lady Polgara, I never once told Garion that I love him. I'd give anything to be able to tell him that. Just once." Yeah, I've been looking for a break, sorry. "He knows, Sinedra. But it's not the same." Sinedra sighed again. A strange lassitude had begun to creep over her, and she had stopped crying. It was difficult somehow even to remember why she had been weeping. She suddenly felt eyes on her and turned. Errand sat quietly in the corner watching her. His deep blue eyes were filled with sympathy, and, oddly, with hope. And then Polgara took the princess in her arms and began rocking slowly back and forth and humming a soothing kind of melody. Without knowing when it happened, Sinedra fell into a deep and dreamless sleep. I'm going to stop here, but I'm going to read one more sentence. The attempt on her life came the following morning. Oh. Questioning the ethics of war. Yeah. Well, that's a cliffhanger. That part is... I mean, every time those peasants come up, it is depressing. Detton and Lammer. And not only that, but because Garion, heard a similar conversation from them before, heard about what happened to Lammer's son and wife, and, he got upset, and I think that's part of what caused him to confront Leldoran the first time, or second time. But Sinedra heard what happened to them and their families, and then she heard that, they were starving, they'd do anything for some food, and she goes, "Okay, come join my army." And she's both, realizing how horrible their lives are, and then viewing them as currency in, the same breath, which I feel like, but she's also realizing that that's what she's doing, but she has to do it. It's just... Oh, is that what it was? Right, it was before he met, it was just before he met Leldoran. So I feel like that's why this was especially rough on Sinedra, this part, because, she knows that they're already, suffering horribly. And, yeah, now they'll have some food before she sends them to their deaths. It's rough. It is rough. Well, she knows what she's doing is using them. Yeah, exactly. But she feels like she has to anyway. It's weird. I randomly got a message that just says, "Welcome to the chat room," as if it had just refreshed or something. Alright, well... yeah. See you Friday. I'll be here. And yeah, we'll finish off chapter 26, 27. I forgot which one we're on. Well, see what happens with the attempt on Sinedra's life. Oy. It was bound to happen, I guess. Alright. I hope you feel better. I hope your migraine eases away gently. Take some ibuprofen or Tylenol or whatever works for you. I feel like ibuprofen is a little more reliable for me, but I think I get tension headaches, so that's probably why. Because ibuprofen is a muscle relaxant. Anyways, yeah.
see you Friday. Have a good night. Sleep well. Feel better. And, yeah, bye.